What if I told you some of the nastiest royal rumours weren't gossip at all, just news that arrived early, wearing a mask? What if the palace's greatest talent wasn't majesty, but management? Tonight we're in the darker, fact-dense corner of British history, the whispers that survived because they were built on something real. Names were changed, letters burned, witnesses leaned on, and yet the truth kept turning up like a bad smell in velvet curtains. I'll be drawing from what historians can actually trace: official records, court testimony, parliamentary battles, private correspondence, diaries, and the kind of public scandals no amount of ceremony can fully drown out. And because this is for sleep and slow listening, we'll take it steady, one rumour at a time, told like a bedtime story, with the lights turned low. If you want more long, quiet history like this, tap like, subscribe and settle in, because we're going in. The bastard Duke, Henry VIII's acknowledged illegitimate son. At the Tudor court, rumours didn't spread like wildfire. They spread like smoke, quiet, unavoidable, seeping into every room. And one of the smokiest whispers around Henry VIII was simple, brutal, and very hard to stamp out. The king was sleeping around, and he'd put a child in a woman who wasn't his wife. The setup looks almost respectable at first by royal standards. Henry had been married to Catherine of Aragon for years, and the marriage had a public problem: no surviving legitimate son. That fact alone turned private grief into public anxiety. A king without a male heir wasn't just a sad husband. He was a national risk. So, when the court started murmuring about a pretty young woman named Bessie Blount, the rumour had extra fuel. If Henry couldn't make a prince with his queen, maybe he could make one elsewhere. Except the rumour didn't stay rumour. Bessie Blount did give birth to a boy in 1519, and in a move that effectively slapped a wax seal on the gossip, Henry acknowledged the child as his. The boy was named Henry FitzRoy, literally son of the king. And that name is the point. Kings could ignore whispers. They could mock them, punish them, banish the people who said them out loud. But you don't name a child FitzRoy unless you're admitting the story is true. Historical records show Henry didn't just privately accept the boy, he elevated him. FitzRoy was made Duke of Richmond and Somerset, an astonishing stack of honours for someone born outside marriage. This wasn't a casual nod. It was a public statement. The king's blood mattered more than the rules, and the king could reshape respectability by sheer force of proclamation. And speaking of reshaping reality, this rumour's consequence isn't only Henry had a mistress. The deeper truth is that Henry was already experimenting with the idea that legitimacy was negotiable if power said so. For a while, FitzRoy looked like a potential solution to the succession nightmare. Not the preferred solution, but a solution. People around Henry treated the boy as a political piece on the board, not merely evidence of royal appetite. Accountability, of course, landed nowhere near the king. Bessie Blount's reputation became part of court folklore, while Henry's reputation stayed somehow virile. The system was built to make male sin look like strength, and female involvement look like scandal. Classic. The patriarchy with a crown on it is still the patriarchy. And the most quietly vicious detail? FitzRoy died young, in his teens, long before he could become a real rival to any legitimate heir. The rumour had been true. The proof had been walking around in silk. And then it vanished, leaving Henry back where he started, desperate, impatient, and increasingly willing to tear up the country's rules to get what he wanted. The divorce that broke a church. If you lived in England in the late 1520s, you'd have heard a rumour that sounded too melodramatic to be real. The king was going to break with the Pope because he wanted a different wife. People said it with that particular tone reserved for the unbelievable, equal parts disbelief and dread. Surely a nation doesn't snap its religious spine over one man's romantic obsession. Except, yes, sometimes it does. Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had started as a diplomatic triumph and ended as an existential crisis. Catherine had been married to Henry's older brother Arthur before Arthur died. Henry married her afterward, with papal approval. Years later, when Henry wanted out, he argued the marriage had always been invalid because Catherine had been his brother's wife. The key point is what changed: Henry's need. The theology didn't suddenly evolve, the king's patience did. The setup was legally technical, almost boring on paper. Is the marriage valid? What does Scripture say? What does canon law allow? But the pivot is pure human hunger. Henry had become fixated on Anne Boleyn, and he wanted not just an affair, but a new marriage that would produce a legitimate male heir. The rumour in the streets, "He's doing this for a woman," wasn't a cheap simplification. It was the engine. The reality is documented in the grinding public slog known as the King's Great Matter. Henry tried to get the annulment through proper channels, pressing Rome, pressuring clergy, leaning on lawyers, and turning his personal desire into a state project. When that didn't work, the political machinery changed shape. Step by step, authority was hauled away from Rome and nailed to the doors of English institutions. Acts were passed, oaths demanded. The king's supremacy over the church in England became law. People who resisted could be punished as traitors. It's hard to overstate how violently personal the origin story was. A marriage dispute became a constitutional earthquake. And speaking of earthquakes, the human cost wasn't abstract. Monasteries would soon be dissolved. Clergy would be forced to choose between conscience and survival. Ordinary people would be required to accept a new official truth. Not because it made spiritual sense to them, but because the king needed it. Accountability again slid uphill and vanished into the throne. Henry didn't merely leave his wife, he made it a matter of national obedience. Catherine was pushed aside, separated from her daughter Mary, and made to live under a kind of dignified captivity. Anne Boleyn became queen, and England became, in law, a country where the king's domestic life could rewrite the nation's religion. If you think that was the end of it, no, it was the beginning of a pattern, the state as an instrument of the monarch's emotional life. The rumour had been rude. The truth was ruder. The monastery raid, religion as a cash grab. Once England's religious authorities started shifting under Henry VIII, another rumour became popular, especially among people with eyes and basic arithmetic. It went like this: the king isn't just changing the church for theology, he's doing it for money, for land, for power, for the kind of wealth you can't fit in a crown jewel case. The setup is the aftermath of the break with Rome. England's monasteries weren't just spiritual communities, they were major landholders, employers, landlords, and providers of charity. They ran schools, cared for the sick, fed the poor. They were also inconveniently rich. Very rich. Their wealth wasn't sitting as piles of coins. It was embedded in acres and rents and rights. Now comes the pivot, because Henry's government began visiting monasteries, investigating them, collecting testimonies and compiling reports that painted many houses as corrupt, lazy, sinful and wasteful. The rumour among ordinary people wasn't subtle. This is a takedown. This is a justification. This is a shopping list with a moral sermon stapled to it. And the evidence is in the outcome. The monasteries were dissolved, their lands and goods seized. The crown's finances received a massive infusion, and huge amounts of monastic property were sold off to nobles, gentry, and well-connected buyers. A religious revolution became a real estate event. Was there misconduct in some places? Historical records suggest there was, as you'd expect in any sprawling institution made of humans, but the scale and speed of the dissolutions reveal something colder than reform. It was an extraction. The state didn't merely correct abuses, it stripped assets. Consequences spread outward in ways people at the top could ignore because they didn't have to live with them. Communities lost local charity. The safety net, thin as it already was, tore. Monastic libraries were dispersed or destroyed. Buildings were dismantled like carcasses. Stones from sacred places were carted away to build private homes, as if holiness could be repurposed into a fashionable fireplace. And speaking of repurposing, this is also where a particularly nasty truth about reform shows up. Henry's England didn't just become more Protestant in a spiritual sense, it became more centralised, more obedient, and crucially more dependent on a landowning class that had literally bought into the new order. Accountability? The king's image was carefully managed. He was a reformer, a protector, a leader cleansing corruption. Meanwhile, the money moved in the background like a second river beneath the first. The rumour, he's doing it for the loot, wasn't cynical. It was perceptive. And once people realised the crown could take ancient institutions apart for profit, they learned a new bedtime lesson. If it can happen to a monastery, it can happen to you. The Queen's favourite, Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley. Some royal rumours are nasty because they're violent. Others are nasty because they're intimate, because they suggest the crown is less a sacred object and more a human head with human needs underneath it. With Elizabeth I, the rumour was persistent and, to her enemies, delicious. The Virgin Queen wasn't very virgin, and her heart, maybe her body, maybe her future, belonged to one man, Robert Dudley. The setup is almost cinematic. Elizabeth becomes queen in 1558. Young enough to be watched like a hawk, clever enough to know she's being watched. The question everyone asks is marriage. A queen's marriage wasn't romance, it was policy. Who she chose could drag England into alliances, wars, religious chaos. So when Elizabeth's attention kept circling back to Dudley, handsome, charismatic, dangerously close, people started whispering. The pivot arrives when you look at how unusual the closeness was. Dudley wasn't merely a courtier she liked. He was given honours, proximity, influence, access. Contemporary accounts describe him as her constant companion. He had the kind of privileges that make other nobles grit their teeth in the dark. And in courts, resentment is basically a printing press. Then, like a gift to gossips everywhere, Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died in 1560 after falling down a staircase. The death immediately became a story. People speculated about murder, about a staged accident, about the Queen's favourite needing to clear the path. Whether those darkest accusations are provable is another matter, and historians remain cautious for good reason. But here's what is solid. The rumour that Elizabeth and Dudley were emotionally close, politically entangled and perceived as potentially romantic is undeniably true. This wasn't later fan fiction. It was a live wire issue in her reign, shaping negotiations, alliances and the public image of monarchy. Elizabeth's genius was that she used the rumour like a weapon and a shield at once. She let the possibility of marriage hover, sometimes to Dudley, sometimes to foreign princes, because it kept powerful men hopeful, uncertain and manageable. Her marital ambiguity became diplomacy, but the cost was constant surveillance and a reputation that her enemies could smear with a single wink. Accountability is interesting here because Elizabeth was the system. She carried the burden and the control, and in a world that judged women's authority through their bodies, rumours about sex weren't gossip, they were political attacks. If you think that was merely spicy court chatter, remember, a queen's perceived intimacy could trigger rebellion, international tension, and internal panic. The truth at the heart of the rumour wasn't Elizabeth secretly married him, or Elizabeth had 10 hidden children. The truth was simpler and sharper. She loved someone enough to make the kingdom nervous. The silk and boots king, James's male favourite. When James VI of Scotland became James III of England in 1603, English courtiers quickly learned something about the new king. He loved companionship, lavishly, emotionally, and often in the direction that made people whisper into their sleeves. The rumour at the time was blunt, sometimes cruelly phrased. The king preferred men, or, at the very least, the king lavished attention on certain men in a way that looked like romance. And whether you interpret it as sexuality, intense favouritism, or a mix of both, the truth that matters for history is that James's relationships with male favourites were real, powerful, and politically explosive. The setup begins with a king who had lived through danger in Scotland and arrived in England with a hunger for affection and loyalty. Then appear the favourites, young men granted titles, land, money and access. Robert Carr, George Villiers, who became Duke of Buckingham, men who rose with dizzying speed. The pivot is in the documentation. Contemporary accounts describe James's physical affection, kisses, embraces, language that reads to modern ears startlingly intimate. Letters survive that show warmth, dependence, and a kind of emotional hunger. Now, to be careful, early modern language around friendship can be more effusive than modern norms, and historians debate what was sexual versus what was culturally permitted intimacy. But the rumour wasn't born from nothing. People around James clearly perceived these bonds as extraordinary. And speaking of extraordinary, Buckingham's power became so vast that it warped policy. He wasn't simply a companion, he was a gatekeeper. Petitioners needed him. Politicians feared him. Foreign ambassadors watched him. The king's private affections became public consequences. This is documented in the constant complaints about patronage and corruption. People believed, often correctly, that access to the king could be purchased through the favourite, that appointments, contracts and influence could flow through one glamorous man standing close enough to the royal ear. Accountability? The favourites took much of the public blame, as favourites usually do. It's a convenient arrangement. The king remains sacred, the favourite becomes the villain, and the system stays intact. But the truth is, James created the conditions. He promoted, protected and indulged them. The rumour, the king is besotted, had teeth because policy followed the crush, and for a sleep story kind of darkness, there's something almost tender and almost horrifying in it. A monarch, lonely at the top, reaches for love and loyalty. The nation pays in resentment, faction and instability. Human needs become national hazards. Meanwhile, remember this pattern, because royal intimacy, whether with women or men, keeps becoming politics in costume. The secret treaty that sold England's soul, Dover 1670. If you wanted to start a rumour in Restoration England, you didn't have to invent much. You just had to point at the king's lifestyle and ask softly, who was paying for it? Charles II was charming, extravagant and chronically short of money. Parliament controlled supplies. The country had religious anxieties like an open wound. Fear of Catholic influence, fear of foreign manipulation, fear that the king's smiling face hid something darker. And then the rumour. Charles was in bed with France, not romantically, though he had range, but financially and politically, that he'd struck a secret bargain with Louis XIV. The setup is a kingdom still traumatised by civil war and regicide. The monarchy is restored, but trust is fragile. Charles wants freedom from parliamentary constraints. Louis XIV, the Sun King, wants leverage over England, and both men understand the same thing. Secrecy is cheaper than open policy. Here's the pivot. The Treaty of Dover in 1670 really did exist, and parts of it were secret even from many English ministers. The treaty involved promises of alliance and, most explosively, arrangements tied to religion and money. The details are complex and argued over in their full implications, but the core scandal is not. Charles negotiated in the shadows. He entertained commitments that, if openly known, would have detonated the political landscape. And speaking of detonations, the public atmosphere of anti-Catholic panic later erupted into events like the Popish plot hysteria and the exclusion crisis. Those later storms weren't created solely by this treaty, but secret dealing with a Catholic superpower poured gasoline into a house already full of smoke. Evidence comes from diplomatic records and later revelations about the negotiations. The key point for our rumour that was true is simple. People suspected the king had a private channel with France and a willingness to bargain national interests for security and cash. They were right. Consequences aren't only ideological, they're financial and strategic. French subsidies could reduce the king's dependence on Parliament. That meant fewer checks on royal behaviour. That meant policy shaped by what helped Charles personally, not necessarily what served the public. Accountability is the usual royal magic trick. Nothing looks like a crime when it's done by someone wearing divine legitimacy. Charles could be criticised, but he wasn't dragged into a modern concept of treason the way a lesser man might have been. The king's secrecy became, perversely, part of his prerogative. And speaking of prerogative, this is one of those rumours that reveals monarchy's darkest advantage, the ability to treat the state as private property. Charles didn't just rule England. In moments like Dover, he negotiated with it. Charles II's merry court and the nursery of bastards restoration. England loved to call Charles II the merry monarch, as if the kingdom itself was tipsy and smiling. But the rumour engine around Charles was relentless, because merriness in practice often meant sex, money, favouritism, and a court where virtue was mostly decorative. The common rumour was that the king kept a parade of mistresses publicly and that he fathered an army of illegitimate children. A gossip version might exaggerate, but the core truth is documented plainly enough to make a moralist choke. The setup is a king returning from exile after years of upheaval. Charles had learned survival skills in foreign courts, charm, flexibility, and the usefulness of pleasure. Once restored, he presided over a court where theatre, fashion, and flirtation were not side hobbies, they were culture. The pivot is the sheer visibility of the relationships. Mistresses weren't hidden in shadows, they were acknowledged, given apartments, money, status, influence. Barbara Villiers, Duchess of Cleveland, was not a quiet secret. Neither was Nell Gwynn, the actress turned royal favourite, who became famous for her wit and for embodying a kind of public, cheeky illegitimacy. Charles also acknowledged multiple children. The exact count depends on what you include and what you suspect, but what matters is the acknowledgement itself. This wasn't a single accident, it was a pattern. The rumour of a nursery of royal bastards wasn't poetic, it was practical. And speaking of practical, mistresses and their families often became political nodes. They received pensions. They got titles for their children. They could advocate for allies, block enemies, and shape the human flow around the king's attention. It's easy to laugh at the soap opera, but it mattered. In a court system, proximity is currency. The nasty truth here isn't merely that Charles enjoyed himself, it's that female bodies became diplomatic terrain and political leverage points, while the king's public reputation stayed, bizarrely, buoyant. He could be forgiven as merry. The women were judged, mocked, or weaponized. Consequences include resentment among politicians, moral backlash, and a court culture that made corruption feel fashionable. It also set expectations. If the king did it, why shouldn't everyone else? The court became a template for elite behavior, and the country watched it like a grim entertainment. Accountability again drifted away. Charles didn't face consequences for the instability that personal favoritism can create. The monarchy, fresh from being overthrown and restored, presented itself as necessary for order, while the king's own household practiced a kind of velvet disorder every night. If you think that sounds like harmless decadence, remember this. When access to the king is controlled by personal relationships, politics becomes intimacy. The rumour was true, and the truth had a budget line. The whispers in Anne's bedchamber, favourites who ran a kingdom. By the time Queen Anne took the throne in 1702, England was becoming Great Britain. Parties were hardening into political machines, and the crown's power was evolving. But one old mechanism remained stubbornly alive, the power of the favourite. The rumour wasn't just that Anne had favourites, every monarch did. The rumour was that her closest relationships, especially with Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, and later Abigail Masham, weren't merely affectionate. They were politically decisive, that whoever held the Queen's private attention could steer the country. The setup begins with Anne's temperament. She was not a theatrical ruler. She was private, often unwell and emotionally hungry for companionship. Sarah Churchill was charismatic, forceful, confident, the kind of person who can fill a room and then rearrange the furniture while you're still blinking. The pivot is in how often observers connected Anne's personal bonds with public outcomes. Sarah's influence was real. Her family benefited. Her husband, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, became central to Britain's military efforts in the War of the Spanish Succession. Sarah's political opinions aligned with certain factions, and her access to the Queen made those factions stronger. Then came the shift. Abigail Masham, a quieter figure, moved into intimacy with Anne. Sarah and Abigail became rivals, and the court split around them like a crack in porcelain. The rumour mills added lurid layers, suggestions of romance, scandal, secret bedroom politics. The sexual claims are disputed and cannot be proved in the way gossip wanted them proved. But the nasty truth that can be supported is this. Anne's personal attachments became conduits for political power. When her relationship with Sarah collapsed, Sarah's political influence collapsed with it. When Abigail rose, different ministers rose. Private emotion translated into public direction. And speaking of translation, this is a theme in monarchy that never dies. A constitution can be written on paper, but real power often moves through human channels. Trust, love, resentment, exhaustion. Queen Anne's reign shows how a country can be turned by a mood, a quarrel, a friendship gone sour. Consequences included shifts in government leadership and the intensification of party conflict. The crown was no longer the absolute engine it had been under earlier Tudors, but it still mattered, especially when the monarch's preferences could tip the balance. Accountability is tricky here because Anne wasn't cruel in the cartoon villain sense. She was a human being with human needs, trapped inside a role that turned affection into leverage. The system is what makes it nasty. It invites people to compete for closeness like wolves around a fire because closeness equals control. And speaking of wolves, next comes a king who treated marriage like a trap and his wife like a problem to be solved with a locked door. The imprisoned princess, Georgi and Sophia Dorothea. When Georgi arrived from Hanover to become King of Great Britain in 1714, Londoners quickly learned to enjoy a certain kind of rumour. The imported king had imported baggage, and by baggage, people meant a wife he'd effectively erased. The rumour was that George's estranged wife, Sophia Dorothea, had been imprisoned for years, kept out of sight, out of mind, out of history, because her existence was inconvenient. That sounds like Gothic fiction, a forgotten woman behind stone walls while her husband wears a crown, except the core is true. The setup is dynastic and miserable. George, then Elector of Hanover, married Sophia Dorothea in a political match. The marriage was unhappy. There were infidelities, resentments, and a court atmosphere where private humiliation could turn lethal. Sophia Dorothea began a relationship with a Swedish nobleman, Count Königsmark. At least, that's the best supported reading of the surviving evidence. Then comes the pivot into darkness. Königsmark disappeared in 1694. He was widely believed to have been murdered, killed in a court intrigue tied to the affair. The case remains historically murky in exact mechanics, but the disappearance itself became part of the legend. Sophia Dorothea's fate, however, is clearer. She was divorced and confined at Oldham House, where she lived for decades, effectively a prisoner. She was cut off from her children. She was not allowed to remarry. She was not allowed to re-enter political life. She existed, but only in a controlled, contained way, like an embarrassment hidden behind curtains. And speaking of embarrassment, when George became King of Great Britain, he did not bring Sophia Dorothea with him. Britain got a king without a queen, not because she was dead, but because she was inconveniently alive. The rumour that a living queen consort was kept out of view wasn't a wild insult. It was an accurate description of a brutal reality. Consequences spill into the psychological texture of monarchy. The crown doesn't merely elevate people, it can enable cruelty by making it seem administrative. A divorce becomes a sentence. A marital dispute becomes lifelong captivity. The system rewards the powerful spouse. Accountability never arrives in any satisfying form. George's reign is remembered more for politics, Hanoverian succession, party developments, than for the woman locked away. Sophia Dorothea died still confined, the world having moved on as if a human life could be edited out of the official story. And if you think that was the nastiest thing a king could do to keep his image tidy, wait until we talk about a king whose mind, not his marriage, became the kingdom's biggest open secret. The Mad King wasn't a fairy tale, George III's collapses. For years, people treated it like a nasty joke with a nervous laugh at the end. The king is losing his mind. Courtiers whispered it. Cartoonists hinted at it. Politicians braced for it. And ordinary people, who didn't need medical jargon to recognize danger, understood the basic problem immediately. If the man at the top can't reliably think, the whole system becomes a carriage with a broken axle. The setup is deceptively calm. George III reigned for decades, wore the crown with a stubborn sense of duty, and presented himself as respectable, almost domestic by royal standards. Then the rumour, something was wrong. Episodes of agitation, strange speech, erratic behaviour, the kind of thing people tried to explain away until they couldn't. Except this wasn't just rumour. There are documented accounts from doctors, attendants and official observers describing severe episodes, most famously the crisis of 1788-1789, when his condition deteriorated so badly that the country slid toward a regency. Contemporary descriptions include relentless talking, confusion and behaviour so alarming that those around him had to manage the monarch like a volatile patient rather than a sovereign. And speaking of management, notice what everyone's first instinct was. Not compassion, not transparency. It was containment. The aim wasn't help the king, the aim was save the institution. Treatments were harsh, supervision was strict, and political plans were drafted in the background like emergency prayers. What caused it? That part is debated, and honest historians say so. There have been competing theories over the years, including physical explanations like porphyria and psychiatric explanations such as bipolar disorder. The nasty truth doesn't require a single diagnosis to land. The truth is that George III had repeated serious collapses, including later episodes in 1801, 1804, and then the devastating final decline beginning in 1810. For the last decade of his life, he was effectively absent, alive, crowned, and unreachable. Accountability, as usual, floated away, because monarchy is built to treat the sovereign as symbolic even when the sovereign is suffering. The state carries on. The king becomes a locked room, and the country learns quietly that stability sometimes means pretending not to see what everyone can see. And speaking of pretending, next comes a prince who perfected the art of living two lives, one for love, one for law. The secret wife in Mayfair, George III and Maria FitzHerbert. If you were in London society in the 1780s, you heard the whisper and immediately understood why it was dangerous. The Prince of Wales had married a Catholic widow in secret, not engaged, not thinking about it, married. The setup is all sparkle and rot. George, Prince of Wales, later George III, was charming, indulgent and catastrophically expensive. He also fell hard for Maria FitzHerbert, a twice-widowed woman with a spine and a faith that made the match politically radioactive. Under the rules of the time, it wasn't just scandalous, it was a constitutional booby trap. Here's the pivot. In December 1785, they did go through a marriage ceremony, quietly, privately, the sort of thing that makes gossip feel like a public service. Under English civil law, the marriage was invalid because it violated the Royal Marriages Act, which required the monarch's consent, and Maria, being Catholic, was its own explosive complication in a Protestant succession. But invalid on paper and not real in human terms are not the same thing. Contemporary observers treated it as a genuine bond. FitzHerbert herself appears to have regarded it as binding in conscience, and the prince, when it suited him, behaved as though he had a wife tucked into his private life. And speaking of suiting him, notice the convenience. When George needed money, Parliament wanted him respectable, which meant officially unmarried and available for a politically acceptable match. So public reality was edited. The prince denied and dodged. Allies deflected. The establishment performed that old trick. If a royal does it behind closed doors, everyone pretends it didn't happen, until it becomes useful as a threat. Consequences arrived later like a hangover. The prince's official marriage to Caroline of Brunswick became a disaster, and the FitzHerbert story hung over it like a ghost at the banquet. Accountability? None, really. FitzHerbert carried the social risk. The prince carried on, collecting both romance and bailout money like they were equally natural resources. And speaking of bailout money, let's talk about the kind of rumour that always turns out to be true when a royal is involved. The prince, who spent like a government, George IV's debts and bailout. One of the nastiest rumours in late Georgian Britain sounded almost too modern to believe. The heir to the throne was drowning in debt, and Parliament would eventually be pressured into rescuing him. The setup is familiar to anyone who's ever watched a privileged person treat consequences like a rumour. George, as Prince of Wales, built a lifestyle designed to impress other people who were also trying to impress other people. He renovated and decorated on a scale that turned taste into a bonfire. Carlton House became a monument to refined excess. Later, the Royal Pavilion at Brighton became another, an architectural shrug that says, "Why shouldn't I?" The pivot is the numbers. By the mid-1790s, his debts had reached an extraordinary level, so vast that they weren't merely personal embarrassment anymore. They became a political problem, because the heir apparent couldn't function as a national symbol while creditors circled like hungry gulls. So Parliament intervened, not out of affection but out of fear of disorder and disgrace. Arrangements were made, grants and acts were passed, commissioners handled debts, systems designed to tidy up what the prince had made deliberately untidy. And speaking of tidying, this is where the rumour becomes a lesson. Royal finances aren't just private money, they become public pressure. A prince can run up debts as a form of political leverage. Help me or watch your monarchy look ridiculous. Consequences were predictable. Resentment grew. Satire flourished. People watched a country squeeze the poor while polishing the prince's silver. Accountability again did that magical vanishing act. The prince's spending wasn't treated as a moral failure, it was treated as an administrative inconvenience, and he learned the worst possible lesson. The system would catch him. If you think that was shameless, remember it, because when this same man became king, he used the state not just to pay bills, but to punish a wife. The public humiliation machine, George III and Queen Caroline. The rumour was whispered with a kind of horrified glee. The king wanted to divorce his wife so badly he was willing to put her on trial in front of the nation. The setup begins with one of the most poisonous royal marriages in British history. George and Caroline of Brunswick were mismatched, resentful, and viciously unhappy almost from the start. They separated. They insulted each other. They lived apart like two hostile countries with a shared border. Then George became king in 1820, and suddenly the rumour sharpened into policy. Caroline returned to Britain to claim her rights as queen consort. George despised her and demanded separation in a way that wasn't merely personal. It was political theatre. Here's the pivot. Divorce in that era wasn't a simple legal process you could quietly handle. So instead, a bill was introduced in Parliament, the Pains and Penalties Bill, intended to strip Caroline of her title and dissolve the marriage. The process became, in effect, a public trial. Witnesses, accusations, salacious testimony, the House of Lords acting as judge and jury. And speaking of salacious, the alleged centrepiece was adultery, tied to rumours about Caroline's relationship with a man in her household, Bartolomeo Pergami. Whether every detail was true remains contested and was contested even at the time. But the nasty truth doesn't depend on proving Caroline's private life beyond doubt. The truth is that the king and his government unleashed an official campaign to destroy her publicly. Consequences were explosive. Public sympathy swung toward Caroline in many quarters. Petitions poured in. Crowds gathered. The monarchy looked less like dignity and more like spite in ermine. Accountability? George didn't stand trial for his own infidelities. He stood above the mess he created, insisting on purity while dragging her through mud. And speaking of mud, if you want to see how low royal scandal can get, let's talk about a duke, an army, and a mistress who allegedly treated commissions like merchandise, sold like meat. The Duke of York and the commission scandal. Sometimes the rumour is so ugly people resist believing it, not because it's unlikely, but because it's too insulting. The one that exploded in 1809 was brutal. The Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, Prince Frederick, Duke of York, was linked to the selling of army commissions through his mistress. The setup sounds like satire already. Britain is at war. The army is meant to be a national instrument, disciplined and professional, and yet whispers spread that promotions could be bought, not through merit, but through access and money. The pivot is that the story didn't stay in the coffee houses, it reached Parliament. A public scandal erupted. Testimony was taken. Mary Ann Clark, his mistress, became the scandal's glittering centre, accused of using her relationship with the Duke to profit from appointments and favours. The mere fact of parliamentary investigation tells you how serious it was. This wasn't just gossip, it was a crisis of confidence. And speaking of confidence, the public didn't need to know every private detail to grasp the moral. If the king's son is tangled up in corruption at the top of the army, what does that say about the state, about fairness, about the value of a soldier's life? If leadership is purchased like jewellery, the Duke resigned as Commander-in-Chief under the weight of the scandal. That resignation is the hard edge of the rumour. Something real had happened, or at the very least, something real had become believable enough to destroy reputations at the highest level. Accountability, though, still came with royal cushioning. Careers were bruised, yes, but the system didn't treat it like the kind of crime a commoner would be ruined for. It treated it like a family embarrassment. And speaking of family embarrassments, next comes a king who spent years before his reign quietly building an unofficial family of his own. The king, with 10 children, outside marriage, William IV and Dorothea Jordan, before William IV was ever crowned. London already had a version of him filed away in its mental cabinet of rumours. He lived openly with an actress, and he had a small army of children by her. The setup begins with Dorothea Jordan, a popular actress with stage charisma and real-world vulnerability. William, then Duke of Clarence, formed a long-term relationship with her that lasted for years and produced 10 children. 10. They were given the surname FitzClarence, a name that practically winks at you. Son of Clarence, but more importantly, son of a royal. Here's the pivot. This wasn't hidden. It was one of those arrangements that polite society pretended not to stare at while staring constantly. The existence of the children was no secret. The relationship was a fact of elite life, the kind of unofficial truth that becomes official in practice because everyone acts as if it exists. And speaking of acting, notice the cruel symmetry. Dorothea Jordan provided companionship, children, and social flexibility. But when dynastic needs sharpened, she was disposable. The relationship ended. Her later years were financially strained and personally difficult. That's a common pattern in royal-adjacent scandal. The royal carries on. The woman absorbs the damage. When William finally became king in 1830, the rumour didn't vanish. It followed him into his reign, a reminder that the crown often sits atop messy human histories. Accountability. William's reputation took some dents, but the monarchy rolled forward. The children remained outside the line of succession, a living illustration of how monarchy can acknowledge blood while denying legitimacy. And speaking of legitimacy, sometimes the nastiest rumour isn't about sex. Sometimes it's about loneliness, about a queen in grief who found comfort in the wrong person and was punished for it with a nickname. Mrs. Brown, Queen Victoria and the man who filled Albert's shadow. After Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria did something the public understood emotionally, but didn't always tolerate politically. She collapsed into grief and stayed there. The setup is the image everyone knows. Black dresses, withdrawal, a queen who became a symbol of mourning. Then the rumour arrived, and it had teeth because it offered an alternative story. Not a widow frozen in sorrow, but a woman still alive, still needing companionship. The man at the centre was John Brown, a Scottish servant from Balmoral, blunt, loyal, constant, and close enough to make Victoria's children and ministers furious. The pivot is simple. Victoria did have an unusually intimate, protective bond with Brown. She showered him with gifts. She relied on him for support and practical help. She defended him against critics, and the closeness became so widely talked about that Mrs. Brown emerged as a nasty public nickname, cruel, gendered, and designed to humiliate her into behaving like the nation's ideal widow again. Now, to be honest, this is where truth splits into two lanes. The rumour that they were extremely close is true, supported by contemporary accounts and the visible pattern of Victoria's behaviour. The rumour that they secretly married is not proven in a way that historians can declare settled fact. There are stories and alleged confessions and fragments of testimony that people argue over, but certainty is not available. And speaking of what's available, the nasty truth is that a queen's emotional survival became public property. She wasn't allowed to lean on someone without being accused of impropriety. The system demanded that her grief be performative, permanent, and politically useful. Accountability? Brown was mocked. Victoria was policed, and the monarchy remained obsessed with controlling the Queen's image, as if controlling her image controlled the country. And speaking of control, Victoria's household would later try to erase another relationship entirely, not because it was sexual, but because it threatened the racial and social hierarchy the palace ran on. The Munshi they tried to delete. Victoria and Abdul Karim. Here's a rumour that made the royal household seethe. The Queen had a young Indian servant who wasn't just a servant. He was her teacher, her confidant, and her chosen companion in old age, and she gave him privileges that made the court feel, in a word, offended. The setup begins in 1887, Victoria's Golden Jubilee. Abdul Karim arrived as one of the Indian attendants presented to her. At first, it looks like a ceremonial gesture, empire in miniature, bowing at the Queen's feet. Then comes the pivot. Victoria became attached. She called him Munshi, meaning something like teacher or clerk. He taught her Urdu. He ate with her. He received honours and gifts. He gained access, and that access triggered a backlash fueled by class contempt and outright racism. Contemporary accounts describe household hostility, ministers and family members resisting his presence, viewing his influence as improper. It wasn't merely, "we don't like him," it was, "he is crossing boundaries the palace depends on." The Queen, stubborn as ever, dug in. And speaking of digging in, watch what happened after she died in 1901. The new king, Edward VII, moved quickly to remove Abdul Karim from the royal sphere. Letters were seized and destroyed. The relationship was scrubbed. Karim was sent back to India. It was an institutional deletion, an attempt to rewrite Victoria's private world so it fit the family's preferred story. The nasty truth here isn't a romantic scandal, it's a power scandal. Victoria used her personal authority to elevate someone the system deemed unworthy. The system responded by erasing him the moment she couldn't stop them. Accountability? The household never apologized. They didn't have to. They were defending proper order, which is how injustice usually introduces itself. And speaking of improper order, let's slip briefly into a scandal that sounds silly, until you realize it nearly dragged the future king into courtroom disgrace. Caught in a card game, Edward VII and the royal baccarat scandal. If you want proof that monarchy depends on choreography, look at what happens when a royal ends up in a court of law like an ordinary witness. People panic, because the entire point of royalty is that they're not ordinary. The rumour in the early 1890s was gleeful. The Prince of Wales had been involved in an illegal gambling party, and now the whole thing was unravelling publicly. It sounded like gossip. It was true. The setup is a house party at Tranby Croft in September 1890. Baccarat was played. Accusations of cheating were made against Sir William Gordon Cumming. The Prince, Albert Edward, the future Edward VII, was there. He was part of the social machinery of the event, and his presence gave the night its explosive potential. Here's the pivot. The matter went to court in 1891 when Gordon Cumming sued for slander, and the Prince of Wales testified. Imagine the scene. The heir to the throne, exposed to cross-examination, dragged into details of aristocratic leisure and private agreements. And speaking of private agreements, That was part of what made it nasty. The scandal involved not just gambling, but attempts to hush it up. The elite tried to handle it internally. It failed, and the failure became a public lesson. The upper class will demand morality from everyone else, while behaving like a club with its own rules. Consequences hit the prince's reputation hard enough to alarm Queen Victoria, who already regarded her son as a walking public relations fire. The monarchy looked frivolous, the air looked careless, and the press smelled blood. Accountability? Gordon Cumming's life was wrecked. The prince carried on. The crown survived. That's how these stories usually end. And speaking of carrying on, Edward VII also carried on with something else the public whispered about for years. A mistress who became so accepted she was almost treated like part of the furniture. The official, Mistress Edward VII and Alice Keppel. By the late 1890s, the rumour wasn't whether the Prince of Wales had affairs. The rumour was which affair mattered most, and whether the Princess Alexandra simply endured it as the cost of monarchy. The setup introduces Alice Keppel, a socialite who became Edward's mistress in 1898. There's a reason her name sticks in history. Unlike many scandals, this one was lubricated by discretion and a kind of elite agreement to look away. Edward visited her regularly. People knew. People pretended they didn't. Here's the pivot. The relationship continued after Edward became king in 1901 and lasted until his death in 1910. That continuity matters. It means this wasn't a youthful indiscretion. It was a long-term arrangement woven into the rhythm of royal life. And speaking of rhythm, what makes this rumour nasty is not merely the infidelity, it's the normalisation. The king's private life became a quiet institution, tolerated by those who preferred stable appearances to uncomfortable truth. Accounts from the era suggest Queen Alexandra disliked some mistresses and tolerated others, and Keppel was often described as one of the more acceptable, discreet, socially adept, not inclined to publicly humiliate the royal household. At Edward's death, Keppel's presence at the edges of the royal moment became part of the legend, proof that the affair wasn't a secret, but a tolerated fact. Accountability? Edward's appetites were shrugged off as personality. The women involved were either demonized or romanticized depending on how well they played their role. The monarchy kept its posture even as its private world quietly contradicted its public sermon. And speaking of public sermons, World War I forced the royal family into one of the most revealing acts of image control in its modern history, changing its own name. They were too German to survive. The birth of Windsor. For generations, Britain's monarchy had been a European family business. Intermarriage, shared bloodlines, cousins on thrones, titles that crossed borders like gossip. Most people didn't care, until war made it impossible not to. The rumour in World War I Britain was blunt. The royal family is German. And when anti-German sentiment peaked, especially as German bombing raids made the war feel personal, that rumour became politically poisonous. The setup is a monarchy with German roots and German-sounding names, sitting uneasily in a nation at war with Germany. The ruling house was officially Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a name that sounded to many ears like the enemy. Here's the pivot. In July 1917, King George V issued a proclamation changing the royal house's name to Windsor. It wasn't just a branding tweak. It was a survival manoeuvre, a symbolic claim of Englishness hammered into law and ceremony. And speaking of symbolism, this is where the nasty truth becomes clear. Monarchy sells continuity, ancient tradition, sacred heritage. And yet, when pressure rises, it can relabel itself like a product in a shop window. Same institution, new packaging. Consequences included the anglicising of titles and a wider effort to distance the monarchy from anything that sounded German. It worked, in the sense that Windsor sounds like stone walls and English weather instead of a foreign duchy. Accountability? None required. The monarchy didn't apologise for its origins. It simply adjusted the story. The public largely accepted it because the alternative, questioning the monarchy itself, was too dangerous in wartime. And speaking of dangerous, there's a far darker rumour from that same era that the king failed his own cousin when it mattered most. The cousins left behind, George Vyse and the Romanov asylum that vanished. The rumour is still told with a kind of moral disgust. Britain could have offered refuge to the last Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, George Vyse's cousin, and didn't. Worse, that an offer existed and was withdrawn, that the Romanovs were left to their fate not because no one could help, but because helping became inconvenient. The setup is 1917, revolution tearing Russia apart. Nicholas II abdicates. The Romanov family becomes a liability in a country tilting toward chaos. Exile becomes the safest idea. Britain, wealthy, stable, related by blood, seems an obvious destination. Here's the pivot. There was an offer of asylum from the British government in March 1917, and then the plan collapsed. The offer was withdrawn in April. Why? Official explanations swirl around political risk, fear of public backlash, fear of unrest, fear that bringing the Tsar to British soil would inflame radicals and destabilise the monarchy itself. And speaking of destabilising, this is where George VI's role becomes part of the story. Accounts from the period describe anxiety within the royal circle about the consequences of hosting the Romanovs, concern filtered through the king's secretary and the broader government mood. Even if you interpret it as political realism rather than personal cruelty, the outcome is the same. The door closed. The Romanovs were later murdered by the Bolsheviks in 1918. No decision in 1917 can be blamed for every step that followed, but it is hard to avoid the bitter truth. A family tie did not outweigh institutional self-preservation. Accountability is the cruelest part. No British official was punished for the moral cost. The monarchy survived. The Romanovs did not. That's the kind of arithmetic monarchy does well. And speaking of arithmetic, next comes a king who chose personal desire over the entire constitutional structure and forced the country to do the sums in public. The king who quit for love. Edward VIII's abdication. When Edward VIII fell for Wallis Simpson, the rumour didn't stay romantic for long. It became a constitutional threat. The king intended to marry a divorced American woman and keep the throne, and the establishment intended to stop him. The setup is 1936, with Edward newly king and already restless under the weight of expectations. Wallis Simpson was not just socially controversial, she was divorced and in the process of divorcing again. At the time, the monarch was head of the Church of England, and the Church's stance on remarriage after divorce made the situation explosive. Here's the pivot. Edward refused to give her up. The governments of Britain and the Dominions opposed the match. Proposals and compromises were floated, including the idea of a morganatic marriage, where she wouldn't become queen. That solution didn't hold. The crisis tightened like a noose. In December 1936, Edward abdicated. The king stepped down so he could marry Wallis. That part is not rumour. It is documented, formal, and stamped into the history of the monarchy like a bruise. And speaking of bruises, notice what abdication revealed. The crown is not purely personal. It is an agreement between monarchy, government, church, and public consent. Edward learned that the hard way. His personal life could not be separated from national symbolism, not without shattering the system. Consequences were immediate. His brother became George VI, reshaping the line of succession and eventually the path that led to Elizabeth II. The monarchy survived, but it survived by sacrificing a king. Accountability is complicated here because Edward paid a price. He lost the throne, but the deeper accountability question lingers. Why did the monarchy demand such rigid moral performance, and who benefited from enforcing it? And speaking of what Edward did after, there's another rumour that refuses to die, because the photographs and events are simply too real to ignore. The ex-king who fed the propaganda machine, the Windsors' Nazi visit. The rumour is one of the ugliest in modern royal history. Edward VIII, now the Duke of Windsor, was too sympathetic to Nazi Germany, and he allowed himself to be used as a propaganda trophy. The setup is post-abdication. Edward is no longer king, but he is still famous, still royal, still symbolically valuable. In 1937, he and Wallis visited Germany. The visit was framed as private, observational, industrial tours, social conditions, harmless curiosity. Here's the pivot. The Nazis treated it like a spectacle. The Windsors toured. They were photographed. They were greeted like visiting royalty. And on October 22nd, 1937, they met Adolf Hitler at the Berghof. That meeting alone is enough to turn rumour into historical fact. And speaking of fact, none of this requires guessing what Edward really felt in his heart. The actions are documented. The trip happened, the imagery spread, and Nazi officials benefited from the association. It was a gift to a regime that lived on symbols. The nastiest layer is how the visit fed later fears that Edward could be politically useful to Germany in a future conflict, whether as a perceived ally, a possible intermediary, or simply a tool to embarrass Britain. Historians debate the extent of his influence and intentions, but the core truth remains. He made himself available to be displayed by one of history's most murderous states. Consequences in the long arc were reputational poison. The Duke and Duchess lived in exile-like comfort, never fully trusted by the British establishment again. The monarchy quietly benefited from distance. Edward became someone else's problem. Accountability? History's judgment is its own kind of sentence, but it's also a warning. When royals think they're above politics, they often become the easiest political objects to use. And speaking of being used, sometimes the crown uses its own family members as symbols of restraint, especially women, especially when love clashes with duty. The love that couldn't be Princess Margaret and Peter Townsend. For years the rumour circled like a sad song. Princess Margaret wanted to marry Peter Townsend, and the system wouldn't allow it. The setup is post-war Britain, a young Queen Elizabeth II, and her younger sister Margaret, glamorous, restless, and watched like a hawk. Townsend was a decorated RAF officer and a royal aide. He was also divorced. That single fact was enough to turn affection into crisis, because the monarchy still lived under strict expectations shaped by the church and public morality. Here's the pivot. The relationship became public enough to cause political anxiety. Behind the scenes, options were discussed. One possibility involved Margaret renouncing her rights of succession to contract a civil marriage. Even that came with heavy costs, social, institutional, emotional. And speaking of cost, in October 1955, Margaret issued a statement that ended the story. She announced she had decided not to marry Townsend, acknowledging the possibility of a civil marriage if she renounced succession rights, but choosing not to take that path. The nasty truth here isn't that romance failed, it's why it failed. The monarchy had been traumatized by Edward VIII's abdication less than 20 years earlier. Another love versus duty crisis was the last thing it wanted. Margaret became the pressure valve, a human life squeezed to protect an institution's stability. Consequences shaped her entire public narrative. Margaret as the tragic rebel princess, a woman whose private desires were always being negotiated by committees of tradition. Accountability? The system didn't apologize, it rarely does. It simply framed the sacrifice as noble and moved on, leaving the emotional wreckage to be managed privately. And speaking of emotional wreckage, our final rumour in this set is quieter, sadder, and arguably more revealing than any affair. It's about who the royal family hid when the story didn't fit the image. The hidden cousins, disability, silence, and being registered dead. The rumour sounded like something out of a bleak Victorian novel, except it happened in the 20th century. Two close relatives of the Queen were hidden away in an institution, and for years official references even listed them as dead. The setup involves Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, first cousins to Queen Elizabeth II through the Queen Mother's family. Both had severe intellectual disabilities, and in 1941 they were placed in Royal Earlswood Hospital, an institution for people with significant disabilities. That part is documented. The placement itself reflects the era's cruel mixture of stigma, class anxiety, and the belief that out of sight was a form of care. Here's the pivot, the part that makes the rumour sting. In 1963, an authoritative genealogical reference listed them as having died years earlier, but they were alive. The truth emerged publicly in 1987, and suddenly the story changed from private family tragedy to public image control. And speaking of control, this is what makes it nasty. Not the disabilities, not the existence of two women who deserved dignity and love. The nastiness is the social mechanism that made them embarrassing. The fear that disability might stain the fantasy of royal perfection, as if humanity itself were a public relations risk. Nerissa died in 1986. Catherine lived until 2014. Debates continue over how often family members visited and how much was deliberate concealment versus the era's cold norms. But the core truth remains. They were institutionalized, largely invisible to the public, and at least on paper, inaccurately recorded as dead. Accountability, mostly silence, a few defensive statements, the familiar royal strategy, let time do the cleaning. And speaking of time, we've reached the point where all these true rumours begin to form a single picture, and it's not flattering. So what do these nasty true royal rumours actually reveal? Besides the obvious fact that crowns don't prevent bad decisions, they reveal how monarchy survives, not by being morally better than everyone else, but by being better at controlling the story. When Henry VIII acknowledged an illegitimate son, he didn't confess weakness. He rebranded it as virility. When he couldn't get a divorce, he didn't accept limits. He reshaped the church. When George III collapsed, the institution learned to wrap crisis in silence and keep the machine running. When George IV wanted to erase a wife, the state was weaponized into a humiliation engine. When scandal threatened the army, resignation arrived, carefully, just enough to protect the royal core. When Victoria loved outside the script, she was mocked into a nickname. And when she loved across race and class lines, her household tried to delete the evidence after she died. And then modernity arrives with sharper cameras and louder headlines. A royal family too German for wartime rebrands itself into Windsor. Stone and weather, not foreign syllables. A king abdicates for love and proves the crown is, ultimately, conditional. An ex-king visits Nazi Germany and reminds the world that royals can be symbolically dangerous even when they're politically sidelined. A princess can't marry the man she wants because the institution still fears romance like it's a contagious illness. And two cousins with disabilities become a story about silence, stigma, and the terror of imperfection. If there's a single uncomfortable truth threading through it all, it's this. Royal life turns private humanity into public risk. Love becomes diplomacy. Desire becomes legislation. Illness becomes a constitutional crisis. And the people who suffer most are often the ones with the least power. Wives, mistresses, servants, children and relatives who don't fit the image. So as you drift off tonight, let the palace lights dim in your mind and notice what remains in the quiet, not the gold, not the ceremony, just a long chain of human choices made inside beautiful rooms with consequences that spilled far beyond the walls.